Good evening. Welcome to our fifth presentation. It's our third year of presenting speakers for the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. We're still kind of working towards the year 2017. That'll be the big year. But this is a big year already having Mickey Mattox here. Mickey Mattox is a friend. We've known each other for a couple of years. I know how many years, because I'm not that old. Mickey is a professor, associate professor at Marquette University in historical theology. His degree is from Duke University, and it was in the area of Luther study, Luther's Genesis commentaries, which is something he's been working on, I guess, pretty much quite kind of off and on for a while, yeah. He did his dissertation, and his first book was a Defender of the Most Holy Matriarchs, Martin Luther's Interpretation of Women in Genesis. So again, it's kind of Genesis interest. He's written many other articles, chapters of books. He's involved with various other activities of professional societies. Recently, he's also working on now on kind of the Reformed area of theology in Oecolampadius. I love that name. Great. That's one of those names you look at and say, Oecolampadius, what a neat name. Anyway, it was his Genesis that you did a translation and a critical edition of the Genesis, a couple of Genesis, his Exposition of Genesis. Mickey also, before he was at Marquette, was a research professor at the Institute for Ecumenical Research in Strasbourg, France for a couple of years, sponsored by Lutheran World Federation. He had done some dialogues there with Luther Catholic, Anglican Lutheran dialogues, so he's been involved with the ecumenical movement quite a bit, and also even at Marquette, continues that work. Before that, he was a faculty member at Concordia University, Chicago, so he kind of was moved from Lutheran to Reformed and ecumenical to Marquette now, so he's at Marquette University. So it's my pleasure to present a friend, but also a good scholar, Mickey Mattox. So Mickey.
Thank you. It works. Okay. I'm very happy to be here. I want to thank, before I start, I want to thank my good friend, Dr. Tim Maschke and Pastor Steve Smith and members of the Refo 500 Lecture Committee for inviting me here to be with you tonight. I'm excited to do this in part because it means for me also a trip kind of home to an institution of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. And I'm grateful for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm delighted to see that so many of you came. Okay? So welcome. The advertised title of my lecture tonight is something about Martin Luther's worldview. Right? I'm working on a larger project, and so what I have to talk about tonight will relate to this title, but not be directly about, say, worldview. What I want to talk about is the way that Luther saw the cosmos. By cosmos, of course, we mean all that is, or at least all that has been created, right? And this is a big project, as you might imagine, since I'm talking about the cosmos and all things and so on. And so I invite you just for a few minutes into my workshop to see some of the kinds of things I'm doing. And I want to say before I start maybe a couple of things. Number one, Martin Luther is still interesting. Yeah, Martin Luther is still interesting. Why? Because in fact, we do not know everything about him. And many of the things we do know, we don't understand. And much of what has been said about Luther in the past can be called very strongly into a question. So Luther is a great figure, and we approach the 500th anniversary of the Reformation with the posting of the 95 Theses and so on in 2017. And I assure you, scholars the world over are very busy and very hard at work treating Martin Luther not as a question that's already been answered, but as a mystery to be resolved. And so I don't think of Luther as one about whom we know all the answers. If I did, I wouldn't want to do any research on Martin Luther, would I? All right, so off we go. I'm going to start out with a little story. I am reading from a manuscript as I go. I'll keep some slides up here for you. I don't have any background music, no flyovers from like the Blue Angels or anything, so I'm going to have to entertain you as best I can myself. And I feel like I'm sort of way back there. Now, is that a little better? Am I okay? Tech guys, am I doing okay, Mike? I just rolled forward just a little bit. All right. So we're going to begin with a story, and the story, of course, is about that fellow right there. In late June of 1540, Martin Luther found himself rushing from Wittenberg to the German city of Weimar. Weimar, of course, is very famous. Here's a nice image of Wittenberg as it was long ago, the Elbe River, a little wooden bridge across. You can imagine the streets are pretty muddy. It really was like that. And so he hopped in a cart or something like that. The elector, the Prince Elector, his top boss, ordered him to go. He found himself rushing from Wittenberg to the German city of Weimar, where Master Philip Melanchthon lay near death, suffering from a severe case of the flu. On his arrival, Luther rushed to the sick man's room. Witnesses at the scene when he entered noted that he was shocked by the younger man's emaciated appearance, and that he proceeded straightway to the nearest window to plead the case before God in prayer, reminding the Lord at great length about all the good reasons why Melanchthon should remain among the living, particularly that he had a great deal of very important work to do, as well as the fact that God himself had promised to hear and answer prayer. The story ends well. His prayer at last ended. Luther returned to Melanchthon's bedside, ignored the man's pleas to just let him die, and when all else failed, threatened him with excommunication if he would not at least eat a little soup. Before long, Master Philip recovered from the illness, scared well, we might say, but it was a miracle in the eyes of those who witnessed the event. If you want to start a canonization movement for Martin Luther, that would be a good place to start, a little miracle to get things going. For our purposes tonight, the most interesting detail in the scene I've just sketched is, have you guessed it? That window. Why pray there? The better for God to hear him, or so it seems. The window, after all, opened to the sky, and the sky to the heavens with its glorious stars and planets, which, as we shall see, pointed beyond themselves to the heavens where God was abiding with all the saints. In drawing attention to this window, I don't mean to suggest that Luther thought God needed to be spoken to outside the room's four walls, as if God couldn't really hear what was going on inside. Luther's God, after all, is closer to each of us than we are to ourselves. There's no space so dark or small or so stoutly enclosed that God cannot be there, hearing the prayers of the Christian in need. Still, the window, with its access to the open skies, does seem to suggest that in an emergency situation, Luther sought the most direct route and access possible, and that in some sense for him, the abode of God is above. In tonight's lecture, I want to draw some attention to some aspects of Luther's understanding of exactly that, what lies above. Tonight, then, we'll take a few minutes to reflect on some aspects of what I've called, rather loosely, Martin Luther's worldview. One disclaimer: we cannot attempt in the brief time allotted to us anything like a comprehensive sketch of Luther's view of reality. It would be foolhardy even to try, and no doubt it would test your endurance as well. Please be assured in advance that I intend no endurance test for you tonight. Instead, I mean only to welcome you into my workshop for a bit and show you some of the reasons why I still find Martin Luther fascinating. Our quest tonight leads us onto a road less traveled, treating a topic that is not frequently associated with Luther's name. Let's see if I can. Luther's understanding of the cosmos has been relatively little considered in scholarly assessments of his theology. Talk of the cosmos with its finite spaces set in relation to the infinite horizons of God and his heavens suggests immediately a set of definable boundaries, a space that is, with limits, a center and a periphery, a beginning and an end. The mental images these concepts bring to mind accurately signal that what I'm after here is the limits, or to put it in more properly theological language, the eschatological horizons of Luther's thought, where created things begin and end. It should also be said that this seems likely to prove a productive avenue of Luther research in part because we already know that he's a decidedly eschatological thinker. For an example, if you know a little about Luther, you might think of his doctrine of justification. You might also think of his understanding of baptism. If you're interested, I can talk about that a little bit later. Perhaps the study of Luther's cosmology will reveal some of the elusive foundations for this eschatological frame of mind that we find in this great theologian, Martin Luther. Sorry, I cut a little something here and I forgot where I was supposed to resume. Perhaps the first thing to do is just to admit that Luther's cosmos was not our cosmos. His was not the ever-expanding universe of the Big Bang with its incomprehensible times and distances, its billions of galaxies, each with billions of stars. Scientists tell us that its ultimate fate is as yet uncertain. The first option, a reversal of the Big Bang, the so-called Big Crunch, in which everything comes crashing back in on itself. The second, no less disturbing option, a Big Freeze, in which the seemingly endless careening and crashing of galaxies dissipates at last into an eternally dark and frozen void, dare we say a tohu and bohu, from which all light and free energy have at last run out. It is obviously not my purpose here to explore contemporary cosmology, nor have I the expertise to do so. But it is important to note in passing the enormous challenges this new cosmology presents for contemporary theology. The story we are now telling or being told about the cosmos is, after all, exactly that, a story, an overarching narrative within which we are challenged to make sense of the stories of our world, our civilizations, our very lives. The specter of nihilism posed with equal force, that is, that everything comes to nothing, right? Posed with equal force by either a big crunch or a big freeze, haunts our age. To this problem as well, I will return later. The cosmos as it was understood in Luther's day was, as we were saying, quite different from ours, similarly grand perhaps in its vast reaches, but at the same time clearly rational, orderly, and beautiful. Here again we have to admit something. Luther's cosmos not only was not our cosmos, it was not exactly his cosmos. Instead, it was the cosmos of both the Greeks and the Latins, as well as the long Catholic tradition, and many of its details had been sketched long before Luther's day. The Christian tradition, as many of you already know, had with varying degrees of success developed syntheses of Christian thought, with, for example, with the best of worldly wisdom. The first such synthesis was that of Augustine with Christian thought with Neoplatonism, and in the great tradition that Augustine founded. The second developed some 800 years or so later when theologians like Albert the Great and Thomas Aquinas crafted a synthesis of Christian theology with the philosophy of Aristotle. There's Augustine on a very nice Algerian stamp shown as a young, skinny guy. I kind of like that. It's a pretty contemporary stamp, I think. Augustine, of course, died in 430 A.D., so he's been gone a long time. He wasn't exactly an Algerian, but okay, yeah. He was from there, and he kind of is their guy. So there's Augustine, who put things together, Christian thought with Platonic thought. And then we have a few guys here who may be a little bit tough to recognize. On the left is St. Albert the Great. This is, the image you're looking at here is what the Germans call an Untersetzer. Yeah, it's a coaster. It's intended for a beer mug. And of course, there's an image of this great saint, Albert the Great, who, together with Thomas Aquinas, shown here on the right, crafted a synthesis between Christian thought, Christian theology, biblical stuff, with the philosophy of the guy in the middle, Aristotle. In both these cases, Augustine's Neoplatonic synthesis and the 13th century Aristotelian one, theologians attempted not just to tame philosophy, Augustine, Plato, Aquinas, Aristotle, but even more importantly, to put philosophy to the service of Christian truth. Faith and reason in these systems were understood as compatible and congruent, though the distinction between the two, faith and reason, was also clearly recognized. More importantly, for present purposes, a third synthesis, that of theology with classical cosmology, had developed alongside them. The classical Christian vision of the cosmos was derived, in large measure, from studies of the heavens accomplished most notably, let's see, I got him there, right? Most notably by the ancient Greek scientist Ptolemy, spelled with a P, right? And by theologians of every stripe. This cosmological vision was beautifully allegorized by C.S. Lewis, I bet you didn't know this, in his much-loved Chronicles of Narnia, and later explored in rigorous scholarly fashion in his last and arguably most brilliant book, The Discarded Image. In the latter work, Lewis led his readers into a lost world. Let's see if we can find it. Ah, there's the book. In the latter book, Lewis led his readers into a lost world, or perhaps better, a lost world view in which pagan and Christian ideas consorted remarkably freely with one another and were combined ingeniously to produce a vision of the cosmos at once consistent with ancient science, Ptolemy, and Christian faith, the Bible. Lewis spoke of this image of the cosmos as having been discarded because he recognized that modern science had rendered it largely obsolete. Lewis himself, however, clearly mourned the passing of this worldview, for it suggested notions of beauty and a cosmic purpose that made sense of our loves and our longings, our leaning forward, so to speak, toward our final end, life, that is, in the far country, the heavens, with God and all the saints. A new synthesis, Lewis thought, and this was 1960, by the way, was called for, but it was sorely lacking. The scientific side of the traditional Christian cosmic vision, as it was mediated to theologians like Luther, is captured well in a crucial work written at Paris University only a few years before Thomas Aquinas arrived there, so like the middle of the 13th century. And it came from the pen of a scholar whose name both reflects his geographic origins and connects with American celebrity culture today. His name? John Hollywood. Sounds pretty good, doesn't it? That'll work, you know. It's like the name you changed your name to, but it's not really your name. In his case, it's really his name. He is John, and he is from Hollywood in England, and he has come to Paris in the mid-13th century as an expert in the Ptolemaic cosmology. His English name was quickly translated into Latin, into the name by which he is known to history, namely Sacrobosco. Sacrobosco, right? Written sometime in the early decades of the 13th century, Sacrobosco's manuscript on the spheres was widely read and frequently copied. Did I get it up there? Oh yeah, we're getting some ideas here now. Indeed, following the invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century, his book, his cosmology, went through 115 published editions. That means that 115 times a publisher took this book and printed it because he thought the book would sell. Okay? That's between 1472 and the last edition in 1656. That, my friends, is a bestseller. 200 years, 115 editions. You've done all right. Okay? Many of these editions included illustrations that drove home the traditional conclusion that the earth itself is a sphere and that it is surrounded by a series of spheres along which the heavenly bodies run their courses. Let's go back to that slide if we can. Here we have a slide that shows, on the left-hand side here, we have a slide that shows, I think this is from a work called the Cosmographia published in 1524. And in this work, we see here clearly, at the very center, the earth, what they say about the ancient cosmology, at least in that respect, is true. Look, there are a couple of things you've probably heard, if you've heard anything at all, about the ancient cosmology. That is that people thought the earth was flat, and they were so naive as to think that their little world was somehow the center of all things. The first statement is completely false. The second statement is a complete misunderstanding of the point. Okay? So what we have here is a kind of map, if you will, of the universe. And this map of the universe, yes, it does show the earth, that's it here, at the very center. I need one of those little pointer things, right? The earth at the center. What's down below? What's farthest down? Heavy stuff. Earth, water. What's a little bit higher? Air, fire. And as we leave out of the realm of the earth, we ascend, as it were, into these concentric spheres. The first being that Luna, right? The moon. And then Mercury, then Venus, then the sun, then Mars, then Jupiter, then Saturn, the 7 classic spheres. All of these are circular. All of these planets and stars are thought to orbit around the earth, as it were, in a concentric fashion as shown here. But as this drawing here does not really give us a good sense for exactly what one finds in this cosmology, because as the ancient cosmologists thought that these stars and planets were a great, great distance from the earth. Therefore, to move around the earth as one progressed outward, they had to be moving, as it were, faster. And so there's a sense then in which the action becomes more intense as one gets further away from the earth. What we begin to see is that the earth's centrality is not really a centrality at all. It's a periphery. It's that tiny little speck in the middle of all these great goings-on. When we move beyond the planetary spheres, we come to this little black stripe here with the little star thingies in it. Can you see it? This is called the realm of the fixed stars, the stellatum. And so in this realm of the fixed stars, the stars shine. And again, this realm moves. Why? Because anyone can go out and see that, the stars are moving. They're not the same all the time. They go from here to there. They change with the seasons and so on. Beyond that, we have the 9th heaven called the crystalline sphere. This is the 9th area. Above that, the 10th heaven. The 10th heaven is called the primum mobile. That's the first thing moved, and so it's a kind of great mystery of the cosmos that something was set into motion, and then all things were set into motion. There is, by the way, no more deeply theological topic in the later Middle Ages and in the thought of Martin Luther than that one. Motion. Motion. Think about it. What does salvation mean? Movement, right? Toward God. Movement toward God. Motion is a deeply theological topic. So as we move up the realm here, as we move through these spheres, we come at last to this 10th sphere where things are spinning at an amazing rate. There's talk amongst the cosmologists, what are they made of? How can they endure the intense friction of such rapid movement and so on? Right? And then beyond that, you see these large words here. How are my Latin students out there tonight? Anybody got that already? Anybody? Coelum imperii, cum, I think there should be a C in front of the VM there, cum habitaculum Dei et omnium electorum, right? The empyrean heavens, where God dwells with all the elect, with all the saints, right? So there's a kind of grand and beautiful vision that in which the earth is not at all flat. Let's back up here a little bit. Oh, whoops. Let's go forward one, maybe. These images are all taken from that guy, John Hollywood. Remember John Hollywood? John Hollywood, Sacrobosco. So Sacrobosco's book is floating around, and I said it went through 115 editions, right? Well, guess who published it in the 16th century? Oh, that would be the Lutherans. Philip Melanchthon and a guy named Simon Grenäus. Grenäus and Melanchthon cooperated and brought Sacrobosco into print. Why? Because they wanted to read and understand the heavens theologically. They wanted to take everything they knew about the reality of the cosmos and put it to the service of the emerging Lutheran faith tradition, which Luther and Melanchthon were working very hard to develop. And so we have here, for example, from this text, we have some illustrations. Now, I'm not sure that all of these are taken from the 1534 Wittenberg edition. They may come from later, I can't remember. But this one you can see in the center. Anybody tell what's going on there? Any idea? The earth is flat, right? No, it's not flat. How do you know it's not flat? It kind of seems flat. How do you know it's not flat? The answer is you're at sea, and the guy on the top of the mast just hollers out, "I see the tower of the city already." You're standing on the deck, and you say, "Wow, I don't see a thing. What's up? What's up with that," right? So you climb the mast, right, and go up there and have a look, and sure enough, there's that tower, which you can't see from down below, but you can see from up here. It's a line of sight problem, right? And so this is one of the classic proofs of the spherical nature of the earth. And I assure you, learned people everywhere for thousands of years knew that that was so. Whatever people say about flat earth, I have no idea where they get this stuff. And they do say it. All right? A great deal of the learning and wisdom found in the cosmological tradition I just described is reflected in the writings of Martin Luther. Luther accepts in broad scope the medieval cosmology, with which he had apparently first become familiar when he heard lectures in natural philosophy in the monastery at Erfurt, as a monk that is, offered by his famous teacher, Jodokus Trotfetter. As we shall see later, we find occasional echoes of Trotfetter in old man Martin Luther's lectures on Genesis. Okay, that's where I work. The latest and most extensive of his academic lectures, which began in 1535 and ended in 1545. Luther lectured on the book of Genesis for 10 years. It's 3,000 pages in the Latin, and they're big pages. Okay, it's a lot. And when he got done, you know what he said? I don't think I've done a very good job. But anybody who thinks they can do better, let them try. Genesis is a killer book to comment on. It's very long, 50 chapters. It's a tough one, right? I want to turn now to some brief examples of what we find in, some of the things we find in the lectures on Genesis, and there are a whole bunch, but just some of them that we find that sort of show how Luther uses this cosmological tradition. There we go. This is an image of, I think that is the first printed edition of the first volume of Luther's Lectures on Genesis. There are 3 volumes in the original publication and came out over a period of about 10 years. The second 2 volumes came out after his death. Okay. So we have here a picture, and look, can anybody see what's going on there? We already have, in a certain way, this kind of medieval cosmology is mixed into the kinds of images that we see there. Because after all, you can't really see it too well, but top right, or top left, what is that? Anybody see that? It's a guy sitting down. If you're sitting down, you've done what? It is accomplished. It is accomplished. You have done it. It is Christ himself enthroned and seated on a cloud, overlooking the world. And we see also a kind of wind or an eye or something from heaven, the Spirit blowing, God active, the heavens above, the earth below, human beings with all their struggles and so on. Right? The folks who drew the woodcut that illustrated that first edition of Martin Luther's Lectures on Genesis knew well the cosmology I've been describing, and they used it. In the Lectures on Genesis, Luther considers a number of cosmological questions: the quality of the heavens, for example, their firmness, the material out of which they are made, the character and stability of the waters the text seems to position above the earth. If you read Genesis carefully, you find that it's like there's supposed to be some waters way up there in the heavens somewhere. It's kind of a weird thing to say. How does that work? He also discusses more than once the spheres, drawing attention to the disagreement of the cosmologists over the question whether the number of spheres is 10 or perhaps 12, whether there's a crystalline heaven at the border of the prima mobile or not. These relatively lengthy remarks reveal not only, as we would expect, that Luther had a considerable knowledge of medieval cosmology, but that he also found it quite interesting, worthy of talking about at some length in the classroom. Luther also shows an awareness of the significance of philosophy for cosmology. In the prefatory remarks that precede the commentary proper, for example, he mentions the ideas of both Plato and Aristotle concerning the world's beginnings, at least in part because he knows his students will be familiar with them. Repeating a commonplace from patristic thought, he notes that Plato seems to have had contact with the Old Testament prophets and thus picked up a few sparks of the truth. The metaphor of spark is significant here because, of course, it suggests immediately light or illumination, by which one knows the truth of things. The heavens are the realm of light, and light, as we shall see, is important to Martin Luther, but it is Aristotle to whom he turns for help in interpreting the stuff that gets made in Genesis 1. Okay? Let me remind you something about the first verse of Genesis 1. Well, somebody here can probably repeat it for me, huh? Genesis 1:1. Sounds kind of like the Gospel of John. Anybody? In the beginning, what? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then what happens after that? God goes ahead and does that. It's almost as if, wait a minute, didn't it already say that he made the heavens and the earth? And now God is creating all these different things. It's day 4 before we get any stars hung in the heavens and so on. Right? In his remarks on this text, Luther puts to work the Aristotelian distinction between first matter and second matter. This is an idea of Aristotle. In the vocabulary of later medieval philosophy, first matter denotes the unformed stuff out of which all things were afterwards formed. And Luther leans on it to explain what it means when Moses says that the original creation, remember that next line? But the earth was formless and void, tohu, or bohu, right? This word, tohu, he says, could be translated here to mean this: nothing, nihil. But how could that be so, since the text seems to assert that God has already made something? Luther explains that the stuff of the original creation, this first matter, was real and existing, but as yet empty, formless. First matter, then, is only the raw existence out of which God subsequently made recognizable things. Those recognizable things are therefore matter in a secondary sense, what Aristotle called second matter. First matter is by definition unformed, and so really, as yet, nothing. Second matter, however, is something in a new way, a reality that God has given definition and concrete shape. It seems significant for Luther's reading of the creation narrative that God speaks only after first matter has been brought into existence. Think again about the rhythm of the text. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was formless and void, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Has God spoken yet? No. Is the Word of God important to Martin Luther? Yes. What then did God say? Let there be light. And when God spoke and said, let there be light, Luther will say simply, for God to speak is to do. When God speaks, something happens. And there it happened. Wow. Let there be light. Light is the first creature of God. Right? Light is the first creature of God. Created things, then, were formed out of the naked potentiality of that first matter. And God, in every case, did it by means of speaking a word. All created things are, therefore, on Martin Luther's account, words of God, including the human beings formed a bit later on. Thus, the narrative structure of Luther's reading of this story becomes clear from the outset. The days of creation narrate a divinely directed movement from disorder to order. The original unformed matter of Genesis 1 was undifferentiated, and God orders it, forms it, and makes it into recognizable things. The order and beauty of the cosmos, then, is visible in nature itself, even in a fallen world, and it testifies to the paternal goodness of God. Isn't there a line from maybe the Small Catechism about that? I believe that God has created me and all that exists. All of us are. All the things we see are, on Luther's understanding, words of God, spoken into existence by God, and therefore addressed by God. To be spoken to by God is almost to have God. It's quite powerful. What we find in the Genesis lectures goes far beyond what one hears in the catechisms. For in Genesis, Luther finds an original natural order alive and perfectly transparent to its maker. Anticipating the story of the creation of humankind in Genesis 1 and 2 and their fall into sin in Genesis 3, Luther informs us that in this life, that is, our life in a fallen world, it's impossible for human beings to understand the incomprehensibility of God in his essential rest. But it was probably not so, he says, for Adam and Eve. What he's saying is that Adam, in his perfection prior to his fall, could gaze on God somehow uncovered. What does it mean in Luther's vocabulary for God to be covered? He comes to us hidden under something. He comes in a breeze that blows in the garden, in a whisper, speaking to Ezekiel, under the mercy seat, in the ark, in the tabernacle, in the mystery of the water of baptism. God is present, God is there, God is working, but unseen and hidden, clothed, as Luther likes to say. Not so for Adam. Adam could gaze on God directly. At least Luther speculates so. In a fallen world, then, as Luther says, the sense of hearing is primary. The church is a mouth house, he says, I love that phrase, and the ears are the organs of faith. But in the bright newness of an unfallen world, the ocular metaphor of light and vision seems to take precedence over the other forms, the forms under which God later hides himself, which I mentioned above. Let's go and have a look at, oh my gosh. Oh, sorry. Are you guys all watching me do this? Okay. There's no privacy anymore anyway, so. Right? The NSA probably saw that. Whoops. Let's see. I think I can get them. There they are. There they are. There are Adam and Eve. And by the way, everything Luther says about Adam, he also applies to Eve. So Eve can also see and know God. There's a word for this, by the way, in theology, and it's a little bit controversial in Luther studies. I like it. Other people, some other people anyway, don't. And that word is theosis, divinization, right? And the idea then is that Adam and Eve are fully divinized in the sense that right all through their bodies, through their minds, through their souls, through all their created faculties, God was already somehow shining. Right? Luther can explain this in a kind of Aristotelian way by talking about causality. And so it works like this. How do you see God, if you're Adam, unfallen, in a created thing? Answer, you look at it, and you can ask this question: where did it come from? How did it get there? What does it do? What kind of causality is involved in the things it does? Aristotle had identified a number of causes, including instrumental, the sort of means through which a thing is done, and efficient, the kind of motive power by which something gets accomplished. But there's a last category of causality called final causality. That is, where a thing comes from and where it goes. Final causality is also eschatological. Right? So Luther thinks that Adam and Eve could look at things and see their final cause, see really where they came from and really where they went, see through things, as it were, to God himself. Now, I've just condensed about 2 paragraphs, so. In sum, then, Adam and Eve in their original creation were deified in the sense that they were suffused in mind, body, and soul with the knowledge of God. Put differently, their original knowledge of nature, including their own nature, was fully theological. Every created thing lifted their minds and hearts to the knowledge and enjoyment of God. This suggests quite accurately that the picture of the unfallen human being in relation to God Luther draws here seems remarkably immediate. That is, the human beings do not merely reflect the image of the next created being up on some kind of ladder of being, say, a power, a principality, an angel, an archangel, cherubim, seraphim. No. They reflect, they image God. And so the relationship, the connection, if you will, is direct. Here we find, in other words, a crucial element in that eschatological framework I said I was looking for. Unfallen humankind in direct and unmediated union and communion with their Creator. However great the heavens may be, however vast the distance, right? Nevertheless, the two ends, so to speak, the human being down here and God in his heavens, are already in direct and unmediated communication. This is made possible, moreover, in Luther's understanding by God's radical omnipresence. By radical omnipresence, I mean simply that God is always, everywhere, all of the time, and all of God is wherever God is. So as the psalmist says, if I rise to the heights or descend to the depths, you're there. God is always there. Luther then thought that the creation as a whole, let's see if I can get back to there we are. Luther then thought that the creation as a whole bears in its very being unmistakable testimony to its maker, at least for the unfallen Adam and Eve. The situation is different in a fallen world. None of us seem to be able to look at things and kind of see straight through them, as it were, to the God who made them and lift our hearts and minds, although we maybe get a little bit of that sometimes, you know. I'm sure my wife feels that often about me. Most people who have teenagers often feel that. No, something like that. All right. All right. Now I'm going to talk about something a little bit different. Though considered a pseudoscience in our day, in the 16th century, as in the pre-modern period generally, astrology was considered by many to be a science. You didn't know we were going to talk about astrology. We are. The influences of the heavenly bodies on human beings seemed clear for all to see. Which of us, for example, has not felt glum under overcast skies, or cheery on a bright sunny day? What we call a day dreary or cheery, after all, not because the day itself experiences drear or cheer, but because of the day's palpable effects on the human psyche. We are influenced, are we not, from without. Who, moreover, has not felt romantic on one of those amazing moonlit nights, that great movie Moonstruck, for example. Didn't we have just a full moon maybe last night, or very close to it? Tonight. It seems like right in your front yard, that sort of moon. Our recognition that there is a certain element of common sense wisdom reflected in the impulses that lead people to the pseudoscience of astrology may make us a bit more sympathetic when you learn that many medieval Christians, including many scientists and theologians, especially among the Thomists, those followers of Thomas Aquinas, also Philip Melanchthon, were adherents of astrological doctrine. Philip Melanchthon was himself quite convinced that astrology was definitely a science, and the influences were very clear. In the later Middle Ages, theologians who found astrology convincing developed explanations for the role and function of the stars in guiding our lives. They recognized that, of course, in the end, God alone rules over the events of our lives. But they thought that God did so not by regularly intervening in our affairs directly, but through the agencies of others, what they called secondary causality. Thus, the heavenly bodies influence our lives, as does the particular astral configuration under which each of us was born. In the 16th century, the scholars' notion of secondary causality frequently combined with popular prognostication. Prognostication is not a word that we often use anymore, but you could sort of think of this kind of thing as like the farmer's almanac on steroids. So it's like these kind of predictions about what's going to come based on alignments of stars and what constellations are doing, and maybe a comet that has streaked by recently or something like that. These works, prognostications, were very much a part of Luther's world. And in fact, his own apocalyptic angst and willingness to read the signs of the times occasionally left him also willing, with caution to be sure, to make common cause with the prognosticators. Let me translate what I just said into English. Okay? Sorry about that. I'm an academic. What can I say? Luther thought that he himself was a sign of the world's last day. The world is coming to a sure end. And that sure end is reflected in Luther's understanding in the betrayal by the Catholic Church of the gospel itself, by the identity of the Pope as the very Antichrist. The last days are upon us. The man of lawlessness sits enthroned in the very seat of the true church. Luther thought the end was very, very near. And so these prognosticators are frequently saying something like, oh, according to the stars, there's going to be a terrible flood coming, or there's some other calamitous event is going to occur. Luther often thinks that these astrological kinds of things are really cockamamie, stupid. But other times, he thinks, maybe you've got a point there. For example, there's a prophecy by a guy named Johann Lichtenberg. And this prophecy of Johann Lichtenberg is published in 1527 with a preface written by Martin Luther. What does it say? It says, there's going to be someone born in 1484, according to the stars. And this someone born in 1484 is going to be a great prophet at the very end of the age. With Luther, we know now his date of birth is 1483, but fact of the matter is they didn't pay a lot of attention to that kind of thing back then. Therefore, it was often identified as 1484, and Luther himself did that. Yeah, it's about 1484, I guess. So here we have a prophecy that seems to be about Luther himself, and Luther doesn't exactly endorse it, but he writes a nice preface for it, and he doesn't mind if people read it. We also have an Advent sermon from 1522. And in this Advent sermon of 1522, Luther says, I've been reading some stuff that says there's a comet about to come by. And when this comet comes by, there's going to be terrible flooding, and it's going to be a sign of the end of the age. Let me tell you why flooding is a sign of the end of the age. Because earth is heavier than water. And so in the ancient physics, in the way they looked at how the world works, dirt is heavier than water. Therefore, naturally, the water should be on top of all the dirt. Why? All the earth. Why is water not covering the entire earth? Their answer, I kid you not, an active, ongoing, day-to-day, minute-by-minute miracle by which the hand of God holds the waters at bay. Human life then is just that tenuous. Just that tenuous. So Luther liked some of these ideas about of the prognosticators, about the end of the age and so on. Talk a little bit about the stars. Questions about the stars came up in the Genesis lectures, and here we have some. This, by the way, this image, this is Divine Comedy. Anybody? Yeah, Divine Comedy. It's Dante with Beatrice, and they are like up in the Empyrean heavens, and they are gazing back down at the beauty of the creation. And so we have these kind of concentric spheres. In the ancient cosmology, what's in those spheres? Living creatures. What are they? They're the angels of every kind, and actually they populate it with a lot more than just angels. So it's very, very busy out there. This is another sort of trick question. Like, in the modern period, people are really worried about what it would mean, say, for Christian faith if we discovered life on other planets. Like, whoa, wouldn't that be like a really kind of a stopper question for the whole religion thing? You'd say, like, look, there's nothing special. No. The medievals also had this idea. They thought that all the cosmos was richly populated at every level. How else would it be? What, would God leave it bare? Right? It just seemed to make a lot of sense. I'm going to tell you one last little story here. For a final example of Luther's reception of this medieval cosmology, I see the relief. We turn now briefly to the problem of retrograde planetary motion. Retrograde planetary motion, a traditional problem that comes up in the Ptolemaic cosmology. Ptolemy and others had noticed that these heavenly bodies that are supposed to move neatly like this sometimes seem to go like, oops, and then like that. They sort of back up and then they stutter forward or something like that. So they're trying to figure out what kind of track of the heavenly body would explain that kind of motion. It takes a good bit of mathematics and a pretty clever mind to explain it. And the notion that they use for it is called epicycles. Their solution, that is, the epicycles, don't need to detain us here. What matters for the moment is Luther's radical embrace of retrograde motion. So what I just said is that the cosmologists, the philosophers, others looked at this retrograde motion and says, don't worry, we don't have to throw out our model of how the universe works. Stop that. We don't have to throw out our model, sorry. We can keep it because we have an explanation for how that works. Right? Luther didn't like the explanation that these folks were offering for retrograde planetary motion, particularly in the case of the planet, what he called a star, Mercury. The retrograde motion of Mercury, Luther insisted to his students, is, quote, a work of God. Why didn't Luther follow everybody else and just look for a good explanation that was consistent with the general theory of cosmology that everyone else held? Apparently, because he thought that the extra steps one would have to take to explain that motion by the appeal to epicycles had become nothing less than a means of denying an everyday miracle that testifies to the power and present working of God. Nothing short of full-on divine intervention, he claimed, could explain the great wonder that Mercury changes its course. And he compared that miracle to the other everyday miracle that I just mentioned to you, that is that the waters don't rise up and cover the earth. Luther's interpretation of retrograde motion reminds us, or at least it reminds me, that he had been trained in a philosophical and theological tradition in which thinkers, like Luther's teacher Jodokus Trutfetter, were concerned to stop the multiplication of metaphysical entities. They wanted to find simpler solutions to problems. And so the general idea is the best explanation for a problem like the retrograde motion of Mercury is the simplest one. The more steps you have to take, the more complicated and convoluted the answer gets, the less we find it believable. That principle, which is sometimes called the principle of parsimony, prefer the simplest explanation, is also sometimes called Occam's razor. It's after William Occam. William Occam is a philosopher in the later Middle Ages. About Occam, Luther could say this: Occam is my master. Occam is my master, right? And so when we find Luther defending retrograde motion in the as a case of divine intervention, then he seems to be doing precisely what we'd expect him to do as one who had been trained in that tradition. What's the result? The end result is a cosmos that is at once filled with divine wonders and hence evocative of our praise, but also for that reason opaque to rational investigation. You can't explain that. It's a miracle. That's what Luther is saying. You can't explain it. It's a miracle. Here, the human mind reaches another one of those eschatological horizons when it discovers the limits of its own powers. Let's see if I can... Yes, I intended to get back to him. We've come full circle. We began tonight by drawing attention to that window in Melanchthon's sick room, which reminded us that Martin Luther behaved like a man who had internalized the cosmological doctrines of his day, and he acted accordingly. We have seen, too, that he integrated secular learning into his lectures on the creation story, which reminds us that Luther, too, drew on the best of worldly wisdom to help understand the teaching of Scripture. Luther's treatment of Adam in his original creation was soaring in the heights to which Adam could go in perceiving God uncovered, but eschatological limits began to emerge there as well, at least as insofar as these texts, Luther names light a creature. What that means is that Adam, in reflecting God or imaging God, couldn't be, in a certain sense, reflecting what God is, because what God is remains, in Luther's understanding, a mystery. Therefore, the image of God is itself, in Luther's thinking, a mystery. These things suggest that we have inched our way forward to teasing out some of the foundations of Martin Luther's eschatological thought. On Luther's account, the eschatological is the emphatically real. The realest things lie at the margins. Everything in between is in its origins a mist, and in its reality, a spoken word of God. Luther's view of the world is therefore entirely theological. Every created thing has itself been spoken into being by God, and in turn speaks out of its being in testimony to the Creator God. This means that in Luther's thinking, there is no pre-theological approach to the natural world. One does not first learn about the world and only then come to the question of God. To the contrary, an answer to this question is implicit from the moment the inquiry begins. We've also made clear that the nihilistic angst of our age has little, if any, place in Luther's thought. The nothing of prime matter, first matter, has already been overcome when this mere mist was given definition, order, and beauty in the acts of creation in which it was formed by God. This truth testifies to the power of God, not only to save us from the negation of our being in death, but also to create a new heaven and a new earth. The far end of the eschatological framework we were looking for is established by its near end. The wonder and power displayed in the creation guarantees the promise. One day, recreation. Lastly, we also saw that Luther is reticent to allow animate, created beings, stars, angels, whatever they may be, a mediating role in the divine-human relationship. The stars are signs, angels are ministering spirits, neither one guides the course of our lives. Wonders in the heavens, he thinks, should be left as simply that, so that through them our minds and hearts may be lifted to the knowledge and adoration of God. Thank you for attention. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Richard.
Yeah.